Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I can't believe it, but this is our 50th episode, and we are excited to be here with you. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director. I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, 50 episodes.
You know, honestly, when you said that, I couldn't believe it. I shook my head. I couldn't believe we've done 50 of these. Is that right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking, they're each about 25, 30 minutes. That means we've spent about 24 hours putting these together.
That's a lot. No, but honestly, I would never have guessed 50. I would have said 20 or so we've done. Wow.
So we're excited to be here with everybody. Today we're going to be discussing an interesting topic. It's based on an event you just were at. We talked about it, I think, last episode. You spoke to a group of young kids out there in Los Angeles. Tell us about the event.
It's a great event. I did it a year ago. I had just arrived as bishop, and I just did it again. It's a gathering of about 9,000 Catholic school kids from L.A., middle school and high school kids. And they come to the Galen Center, which is a big kind of like basketball arena at the University of Southern California, so right in the heart of L.A. And it's just an electric environment. It's a bit like a mini World Youth Day for the Catholic kids of L.A. There's a lot of singing and games and prayer, Blessed Sacrament, talks. So I gave a talk at the very end of it, kind of a wrap up, fervorino, send you out sort of talk. And I loved it both years. It's a lot of fun. And the kids, I don't know, they really seem into it. And they get both the fun and the serious part of it. So I really appreciate it.
So you walked out on stage, and the first thing that you had them do was to scream as loud as they could. What was that all about?
Well, when I came last year, I just arrived at the arena, and I forget what was going on. But for some reason, every kid was screaming. And I was so impressed by to me, it sounded like jet airplanes taking off, or what I remember from records of a Beatles concert when the Beatles came out and these young kids like that age scream. So anyway, I had them do it, and it is impressive. And you have 9,000, 18,000 lungs all screaming at the same time. But then what I said to them was, okay, I want you to remember that sound. If we could harness the energy in the room right now for Christ and his purposes, we transform this whole city. And I believe that. That's Vatican II. That's the priesthood of all believers. That's the universal call to holiness. That's invading the secular space with the power of the gospel. And I think we Catholics underestimate the kind of power we'd have in this culture if we could just harness it.
And so toward that end of harnessing all the energy of these young people, you gave this great talk. You offered them 3 lessons for young Catholics, 3 spiritual lessons. So we're going to spend the rest of this episode walking through each of those 3 lessons and unpacking them a little bit. So the first lesson that you offered was to turn their life into a gift. What do you mean by that?
It's that John Paul II, the law of the gift, right? Your being increases in the measure that you give it away. Once I read that law and thought about it, I thought, yep, that's it. That's a summary statement of the Christian life, because every impulse in the secular culture is in the opposite direction. It says if you fill your life up with things, you'll be happy. So we're basically like this empty cage, and you got to fill the cage up with a requisite amount of pleasure, honor, fame, power, etc. Right? I would argue, and I told the kids this, every movie they watch, practically every commercial, every cultural avatar they listen to will convey that message. Fill your life up with these missing things to a sufficient degree, you'll be happy. The reason you're unhappy is you don't have enough of something. But see, the Bible tells this story from page 1 of Genesis to the last page of Revelation over and over again that's a lie. We have an infinite hunger for God, and therefore nothing finite can ever fill it up. And in fact, the more you try, the more frustrated and addicted you'll become. And I would submit, Brandon, to you or anybody, that's the story of our time, is a lot of people becoming increasingly frustrated and addicted. Just for one example, look at the pornography problem among young people. And young people hear me right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Is the internet generation has been so affected by this. You try to fill up the empty cage of your ego with the goods of the world, you'll become increasingly frustrated and addicted. Wealth, pleasure, honor, power, whatever. The whole point is just the opposite. Empty your life out. make of your life a gift, and you'll find the divine life flooding into you. Why? Because God is love. And so the more we conform our lives to love, the more of God's life we get in us, if that makes sense. Science people, it's a kind of physics formula I'm using here, but it's a spiritual physics. Like the laws of physics in the ordinary sense, a lot of them are counterintuitive, right? You start studying, quantum mechanics and all this stuff. There's an awful lot of counterintuitive business. Same in the spiritual life. You want to be happy, empty your life out. Give it away. Give what you have away, and you'll find the divine life increasing in you. So I told the kids, Peter Morin, the founder of the Catholic Workers, said, we got a society of go-getters. I want a society of go-givers. And that's it. I want them to be go-givers.
It's easy to think that a lot of the things that we try to fill this infinite cavern with make us happy. In my own life, I think of things like Netflix or Facebook or food or all these, you mentioned money, power, pleasure, honor, some of the more specific tendencies today. I would imagine among your middle school and high school audience, things like video games or Instagram or those kinds of things. What would you say to somebody who's experienced all of these admittedly good things, and thinks that they make them happy? We could say you still are unsatisfied, you're still unhappy, but what if they push back and say, well, actually, I feel pretty good about myself. I'm pretty fulfilled. I'm not. What do you say to people who deny that they're unsatisfied?
Well, I don't believe them. And what I would say is what you're witnessing to is that you're relatively happy through these things. They can make you relatively happy. That's to say, happy for a time, happy for a moment. And again, that's not bad. So I sit down at the end of the day. Sometimes I watch Netflix. I watch a movie. I get involved in it. I get a kick out of it. Catholics aren't Puritans. We like sensual pleasure, including sexual pleasure. We like pleasure in food and drink. Nothing wrong with that. And you can be relatively happy. So like my favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs, right? I know I'm a low-level guy when it comes to that. When I'm eating a good plate of spaghetti and meatballs and I'm really hungry, and then I finish that thing, and I'm satisfied in a restricted way and for a very short period of time, right? I'm relatively happy. The point, though, is that we all are hungry for unconditioned happiness. We want happiness in the full sense. And nothing in the world can ever give that to us. Now, once you've got your life properly ordered, it's ordered to God, fine. Then use wealth, pleasure, honor, power, Netflix, your popularity, whatever it is. Use them for the purpose of love, and you'll be fine. You got power? Fine. Use it for love. You're experiencing pleasure? Fine. Put it in the context of love. By the way, the church's sexual teaching, you want that in a nutshell? There it is. Is may your sexual energies always be subordinated to the path of love. That's the church. It's not puritanical. It's ordered to love. So that's the formula. Augustine said long ago, love God and then love everything else for the sake of God. Or love God alone and then use everything else for God's purposes. Fine. That's the formula, see? So it's not a strict either or. It's not an either or. It's a right ordering of your love. That's Catholic life.
In this first lesson, you held up Mother Teresa as the embodiment of this law of the gift. How is that so?
Yeah, I mean, in my lifetime, I know she's been gone now. It's hard to believe, for almost 20 years. She died in 1997. So I know for younger people, she's becoming a distant memory. But for my generation, she was the living saint. If you wanted to point not to just someone in a stained glass window, but someone alive, you'd point to her. Because she got it. She got that. Give your life away and give it away utterly. So I'm going to give myself in total service to the poorest of the poor. I don't know anyone who embodies it better than she does.
What strikes me, not only about her, but about her sisters, and you've met many of them traveling around the world, is that they have none of these four substitutes for God in most cases. No money, no pleasure, no honor, no power. Yet they're the most radiantly joyful people in the world. Yes, and that's how it works. It's like this morning, I said Mass for the Poor Clares, and who are here in Santa Barbara. So the Poor Clares, live a very austere, very simple, a cloistered life. They've eschewed those four things. I mean,
No one here in Santa Barbara even knows them. Fame, money, pleasure, power, none of that. But the gospel for today, we're recording this on All Saints Day, Beatitudes. Well, what's Beatitudes all about? It's don't get hung up on wealth, poor in spirit. Don't get hung up on pleasure. Don't get hung up on power. Be meek. Don't get hung up on fame. Blessed are you when they persecute you. The Beatitudes are a program of freedom. And I told the poor Clares, I said, well, you witness that to all of us here in the city. So that's the way it works.
So in your talk to the 9,000 middle schoolers, high schoolers at the Galen Center at USC, you gave 3 lessons. The first one was make your life a gift, turn your life into a gift. The second lesson here is don't settle for spiritual mediocrity. Why'd you feel it necessary to teach that to the young kids?
Because I think they hear the message in a million ways, that they should be excellent in sports and excellent in the arts, excellent in their friendships, outstanding in their academic achievements, go to the best schools. Are they settling for mediocrity in any other area? No, they're kind of driven to it. But somehow when it comes to religion, it's like, oh yeah, go to mass once in a while, I guess. And, I'm not going to really study my faith or worry about it. I'm much more worried about my advanced placement, in chemistry or something. So why do we accept the call to excellence in every area except the one where it matters the most, which is in our relationship to God? We should be striving for excellence there. And so my mind drifted back to John Paul II and the way he formed these young people that he knew in Krakow as a young priest. And what he formed them in was a kind of spiritual excellence, to be great Catholics. And then they, as they came of age, became great Catholic writers and great Catholic business leaders and great Catholic politicians. And so when the propitious moment came and John Paul, now as Pope, wanted to unleash the energy of that country, he turned to these people that he had formed. So I looked out at these 9,000 kids and thought, well, why is the church, satisfied with mediocrity? Let's call all these kids to be saints, and they would indeed set the whole world on fire, So what matters in the end? My accomplishments in this world, my degrees, my job, my money. No, none of that matters in the end. All of that fades away. What remains is your relationship to Almighty God. So why are we accepting mediocrity when it comes to the one thing that matters? That's the point I made to them.
One saint here who comes to mind is one of our mutual heroes, Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, a young guy who did pursue excellence in almost all the other areas of his life. He was an outdoorsman, a mountain climber, verso l'alto. He wanted to go to the heights of the mountains, but he also pursued excellence in the spiritual life too. I think that's part of the reason why he's so attractive to many young people, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I remember one of the most moving moments at World Youth Day this past summer is we were coming back from something and we passed this Dominican church. And there's a sign indicating that inside was the coffin of Pier Giorgio Frassati, who's the sort of patron of World Youth Day. So they literally bring his body wherever the World Youth Day is, and there it was. And so I was with John Carney, one of our great workers at Word on Fire, and the two of us went in, and I was able to kneel within, almost touching distance of the coffin of Frassati. And that was very moving to me because, here's a guy that spent his day climbing mountains and, involving himself in political activity and serving the poor, et cetera. But then his nights he'd often spend in Eucharistic adoration for hours and hours. Verso l'alto in the physical sense, climbing mountains, but verso l'alto in the spiritual sense. Let's go to the heights. And, verso l'alto is a legitimate translation of duc in altum, the Latin from the gospel there, go into the depths. Jesus saying, don't be satisfied with the shallow waters, but go out into the depths. I wanted the kids to hear that message.
One thing I think young people need to be exposed to as well is that Catholic saints who are excellent in the pursuit of holiness aren't monochromatic. You've talked about this quite often, that I think for a lot of young people, when they hear, we need to be spiritually excellent, that means we need to be a cloistered nun or a religious brother. Yeah. We need to be on our knees all day. Talk about the need for a more colorful and broad and vibrant idea of holiness.
Yeah, think of the saints, who are variegated as all get out. I mean, there's actually very little sameness about the saints. They're all very distinctively, uniquely textured. I've used the image before of, think of God as this great white, intense light. But when it breaks through the prism of creation, it fractions into an infinite variety of colors. And each distinctive color is reflecting something of the divine perfection, right? We're not going to see all the divine perfection at once, but in the saints, we can see this refracted light, refracted color that gives you some idea of God. And so a Joan of Arc, a Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, Pier Giorgio Frassati, Mother Teresa, Jose Sanchez del Rio, they all are speaking some truth about God, which is why God wants them to flourish, in their variety. So no, it doesn't mean by any means that we have to, just live one form of life. That's part of the mystery and beauty of it, isn't it? How people feel called in different ways. So a young Thomas Merton, think of Merton who, talk about a young go-getter and full of the future and he wants to be a great writer and all this, feels the call to be a Trappist monk. I was deeply influenced by Merton when I was a young kid, and he influenced my decision to become a priest, but I never really felt the desire to become a Trappist monk. I think God was calling me to a different kind of work. Good, fine. By the way, I'm not claiming that either Merton or I am a saint. I'm just saying that's the way it goes in the spiritual orders, that we get called in different ways to reflect something of the divine perfection.
You're listening to the Word on Fire show here. I'm talking with Bishop Robert Barron about a talk that he recently offered to 9,000 young people out at the Galen Center at the University of Southern California. We've covered the first 2 of the 3 lessons you gave them, which was to make your life a gift and to strive for spiritual excellence. Don't settle for mediocrity. The 3rd lesson you gave was to be a rebel. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, here's this room full of teenagers, right? Well, teenagers from time immemorial are rebels. They like that. They like to kind of stand against the man, right? Stand against the authorities and so on. Well, I reminded them, look at the one whom we worship is a crucified criminal. Jesus stood enough athwart the institutions of his time to get crucified. I reminded them that every one of the apostles, with the exception of St. John, went to his death, put to death by the society of their time. For the first century of the church's life, every pope was put to death. So and then look at up and down the centuries, the number of martyrs. Well, to be a martyr means you're standing so against the powers that be that they put you to death. We are a religion of rebels. But see, here's the point I was making. Don't bore me with this insinuation that, the rebels are like hip hop singers or rap artists or some pop star. Give me a break. Listen to 98% of those songs. They're all about wealth, pleasure, power, honor. They're all about filling up the empty cage of the ego. They're about, listen to me, as mainstream and ordinary and establishment as you can get. Don't give me movie stars and pop stars. They are not the rebels. The real rebels are the saints, the ones who stand athwart the ordinary view of things, and the powers that be. And so I want to harness that rebellious energy, but I want them to see being a great saint is a far more effective and interesting way to be a rebel. The rebels that the culture puts before them, and mind you, young people get this. The culture is putting them before you. These are propped up figures, propped up by the establishment, right? I'll give you the saints that the establishment wants to marginalize and at the limit kill. They're the real rebels. And so I call those 9,000 kids, be that kind of rebel. Stand in the army of Jesus, stand on his side. Stand with the army of the martyrs, and you'll be a real rebel. And that's a good thing.
One of the martyrs that you highlighted in particular was a young man who you just mentioned a couple minutes before, Jose Sanchez del Rio. Tell us his story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. He's one of the most recently canonized saints now by Pope Francis. And he was featured in that movie, For Greater Glory, the movie about the Cristero movement, which, during the 1920s in Mexico, there was a brutal repression of the Catholic Church on the part of a hyper-secularist government. And I mean brutal. They're putting priests and nuns to death, burning down churches, harassing people, trying to stamp out the faith in public institutions. Priests could not appear publicly with religious garb on, et cetera, et cetera. Read Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory if you want the texture of that time. Anyway, during that period, this little kid, 14, Jose Sanchez del Rio, joins the Cristero army, not as a soldier who's too young, but kind of as an aide, Well, he's captured, and they wanted to make a show of him, so they're compelling him to surrender, to renounce his faith, and he wouldn't do it. They tortured him over and over again. He wouldn't give up. They finally lacerated his feet, and that's vividly depicted in the movie, and they forced him to walk on these severely wounded feet to a cemetery. He was made to stand at the edge of a grave, and they said, "We've dug your grave." And they told him, "Renounce your faith, we'll let you go." He wouldn't do it. Finally, they shot him, but not mortally, and lying literally on the edge of his own grave, wounded, they said, "All right, just renounce your faith, and we'll let you go." He wouldn't do it. Instead, he used the great phrase of the Cristero movement, "Viva Cristo Rey," right? Long live Christ the King, not you phony pretenders to kingship. And then he said, "Viva la Señora de Guadalupe," long live Our Lady of Guadalupe. And with that, they killed him. Now, listen to me. In my book, that's a rebel. That's a rebel that's really worthy of imitation. That's a cool role model, not some goofy pop star. Those are propped up establishment figures, hip hop stars. Give me a break. They're sponsored by mainstream advertisers. You know what I'm saying? Young people, listen to me. Those aren't rebels. The real rebel is this kid, tortured practically to death, refusing to surrender his faith. That's someone I'd like you to imitate.
Martyr, as you've said before, means witness, to testify to the faith. And I've noticed in my life, especially among my atheist friends, that it's often more heroic and more difficult to come out publicly as a faithful Catholic than it is today to admit you're an atheist. I mean, wouldn't you say that's the case?
Yes, absolutely. The only what's the Peter Crayf line I always like? The only real rebellion in a age of relativism is orthodoxy. I mean, to be an Orthodox person, that's the real rebellious position today. And so, young people, you want to be a rebel, off you go, but be a real rebel, not one of these phony, fakers.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from one of our listeners. Each episode, we take one question from you, and we'd love to hear from you in particular. So visit askbishopbarron.com, record your question, and every single week we choose one to air here on the show. Today we have a question from Dan from Pensacola asking about difficult gospel passages. So here's Dan.
Hey, Bishop Barron, it's Dan from Pensacola. I have a question about some of the difficult readings and messages of Jesus. For instance, you recently talked about the dishonest steward parable, but I still find that story rather unsatisfying because I just can't fit it into what I think the gospel's central message is. So my question for you is, what are some of the more difficult gospel passages for you to grasp, and how do you go about reconciling them with what your faith tells you about the good news? Thanks.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. And Pope Benedict talked about that and the importance of wrestling with the hard passages in both the Old Testament and New. Probably for a lot of people in the Old Testament, the ones dealing with violence and putting the ban on cities and all that stuff. But you're right. In the New Testament, Jesus has a lot of things that are kind of troubling. For me, I'll tell you one of the tough ones. I preached on it for years, but it's because I wrestle with it. Is hey, Lord, I'll come follow you, but first let me bury my father. And you think, well, yeah. I mean, who would ever gainsay that? But Jesus does. He said, let the dead bury their dead. I mean, it seems so insensitive and so kind of almost cruel, But see, here's the thing you have to do is don't primarily psychologize or even moralize, but rather primarily theologize. What I mean there is the gospel is trying to make a theological point. Now, from which will flow moral conclusions, to be sure. But the primary point there is not morality. What I mean is if I'm a pastoral minister and someone has told me that his father's died, I don't think that's what I would recommend saying to him. You know what I'm saying? That's not a practical, pastoral, moral. It's making a theological point, see, which is nothing is to be preferred to the worship of God, even what's nearest and dearest to you. So read it with those lenses in place, and then I think it opens up. The gospel is always fundamentally trying to make this point, to bring us back to right worship. And once you get that, then you can sort of put the moral teaching in a better context. That's one way I'd get at it. But here's a more general point I want to make about it, is let the hard statements be and let them bother you. I'm reading a book right now that I really like, and maybe I'll do something about it later, Sally Reed's book called The Night's Bright Darkness. It's a really good story of conversion. But she talks about coming of age as a total atheist, total non-believer, and living in this very kind of nicey society where the ultimate value is inclusivity, non-judgmentalism, let everyone do what they want, nice, right? Well, when she comes to the faith finally and begins to read the Gospels for the first time, you know what most struck her was how sharp and difficult and demanding Jesus is. Because she'd been taught in her hyper-secularized culture, oh, well, Jesus, he just stands for inclusivity and he's always nice. And he's not nice. Jesus, are you kidding? He's many things. He's not nice. He's overwhelming, and he's startling. And as Chesterton said, for every statue of the gentle Christ, there should be a statue of the ferocious Christ, because they're both on display in the Gospels. Let the ferocious Christ be, would be part of my recommendation to you.
One of the most difficult passages for me is the one that we heard this morning. We're recording this on All Saints' Day. The gospel was the Beatitudes. We've heard these over and over again, and we've sort of sentimentalized them, and they've become nice spiritual platitudes. But these are really difficult commands and suggestions. What do you say? The Beatitudes of Christ?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Look at the whole Sermon on the Mount. This is not the discourse of a Mr. Nicey. In fact, turn the other cheek. Someone strikes you on one cheek, turn and give them the other. That's many things. It's not nice. It's not easy. It's not a sort of superficial inclusivity. Love your enemy. Try that sometime. When you give a party, don't give it to those who pay you back. Give it to those who can't possibly pay you back. Sermon on the Mount is a deeply disturbing document. So yeah, let Jesus be a little strange. That's a good thing.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Advent is right around the corner. It's going to start here in just a few days, and we'd love to send you daily reflections from Bishop Barron. If you visit adventreflections.com, you'll join over 300,000 people in receiving these reflections every single day throughout Advent. So be sure to visit that website and sign up today. Just go to adventreflections.com. It's totally free. It takes just a couple seconds, and sign up to receive your free daily reflections. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.